We always feel alarmed when we hear their sirens. But if we were the ones who called them, we would definitely be relieved. We wish we would never have to need them. But when we do, we are so grateful to have them responding to our distress calls and in many cases, saving our lives or the lives of the ones we love. In today's Word Power episode, we're going to talk about the birth of the International Red Cross. And we're going to learn 10 new words in context. This is your host, Danny, and this is a new Word Power episode from English Plus Podcast. Now, before we start, let me remind you that you can practice everything you're going to learn in this episode on the website EnglishPlusPodcast.com. There's a link in the show notes that will take you to the custom post I created for this episode, where you will find everything you need to make sure you add these words to your active vocabulary bank. There are two different types of practice. Interactive practice you can do on your website from the comfort of your PC, phone, or tablet. And for those who prefer pen and paper, there's also the PDF practice worksheet that you can download and practice not only the 10 words we're going to learn in today's episode, but also the words we have learned in the previous 4 Word Power episodes. And now for our big announcement. August will be the beginning of a new chapter in English Plus Podcast's life. I'm going to continue creating the content you like, of course. Nothing's gonna change about that, but I'm making some extra premium content that will be available only to my patrons on Patreon. This is a great time for you to become a patron, as there will be great premium content added on a weekly basis. There's going to be our vocabulary and speaking episode series on Mondays, our brand new Business English series on Tuesdays, our premium fiction series on Wednesdays, and our premium nonfiction series on Thursdays. Of course, that doesn't mean that all the episodes will become premium. English Plus Podcast will continue just as before. We have 2 new series coming up next week, our regular Word Power episodes, our Plus Stories, and our brand new Plus Talk episode every Friday. So, English Plus is not changing, it is evolving to bring more value and benefit to you and to make sure we have the resources necessary to continue. So if you want to be part of English Plus Evolution that will start next week, become a patron today and enjoy listening to all these new premium series exclusively available to my patrons on Patreon. The link to my Patreon page is in the show notes, so what are you waiting for? Enjoy great benefits and support the show you love on Patreon. And now, without further ado, let's start talking about the birth of the International Red Cross. On June the 25th, 1859, a Swiss banker witnessed a battle and its aftermath, an experience that would change his life and the lives of millions more. Jean-Henri Dunant was in Italy hoping to get the authorization of Emperor Napoleon III to import windmill into what was then the French colony of Algeria. He never got his interview with Napoleon. Instead, the emperor and his ally, the King of Sardinia, mobilized troops against Austria in the hill town of Solferino. Dunant spent the days that followed the battle working among the thousands of injured soldiers. The gentleman in white, as the soldiers called him, knelt in the dust in his linen suit, bathing their festering wounds and offering sips of water. On his return to Geneva, Switzerland, Dunant was beset with concern over the lack of organized medical care on the battlefield. Obsessed with the idea of trying to alleviate future suffering and hoping to arouse in others his own fervent conviction that Europe's wounded soldiers should never again have to suffer such dire suffering, he wrote a booklet titled A Memory of Solferino. In his final sentence, he set forth his plan in a question. Would it not be possible, in time of peace and quiet, to form relief societies for the purpose of having care given to the wounded in wartime by zealous, devoted, and thoroughly qualified volunteers? Well, that was a question that indeed sparked the idea of the entire Red Cross. But anyway, let's continue and see the impact of this booklet Dunant wrote. Although the booklet aroused heartening interest throughout Europe when it was published in 1862, it moved a group of people in Geneva to take action. Philanthropists decided to form a committee to actuate Dunant's ideas and asked him to be a member. During the fall of 1863, delegates from all over Europe discussed the societies of volunteers that would be trained to aid the wounded in time of war. When one doctor suggested that the volunteers wear a distinguishing mark as a signal that they were neutral civilians, the symbol of the Red Cross was born. The first national relief societies came into existence 2 months later in several German states. When they attempted to go to the aid of the wounded in a war between Prussia and Denmark, however, they were turned back by the distrustful military. The Geneva Committee was discouraged. If the relief societies were going to achieve their purpose, an international agreement of a purely humanitarian nature had to be reached. In August 1864, the Geneva Convention did just that. By 1869, 10 years after the Battle of Solferino, hundreds of Red Cross societies were operating and 22 nations had signed the Geneva Convention. Within a single decade, Jean-Henri Dunant had fulfilled his plan and lifted the conscience and compassion of a whole continent to a new level. So, that was our story about the birth of the International Red Cross. I hope you learned something you didn't know about before about how it started, and I hope you found it interesting. Well, that was interesting enough, of course, but it's not as interesting as learning 10 new words in context. And let me tell you about the 10 words we're going to learn in the context of our story today. We're going to learn mobilize, fester, beset, alleviate, fervent, dire, zealous, heartening, actuate, and humanitarian. So, are you ready to start? As usual, I'm going to ask you a question first, see if you can guess the meaning on your own, and then of course I'll be back to talk about these words a little bit more. So, if you're ready, let's start doing that, and let's start with our very first word, and that is mobilize. That's coming next. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. So our very first word is mobilize. M-O-B-I-L-I-Z-E. Mobilize. First, let's take a look at how we use that in context. We said he never got his interview. Of course, we're talking about Jean-Henri Dunant. He never got his interview with Napoleon. Instead, the emperor and his ally, the king of Sardinia, mobilized troops against Austria in the hill town of Solferino. So they mobilized troops. First, let me ask you the question. Which word or words do you think could best replace mobilized in this context? Could we replace it with assembled, crushed, made automatic, or restored to original condition? Which one do you think is the answer? Think about it, and I'll be right back with the answer and a little more explanation. So for those of you who thought assembled is the best word that could replace mobilized in this context, you're absolutely right. If a whole country mobilizes or actually mobilizes its armed forces, they are given orders to prepare for a conflict. So they are assembled to go to battle or to go to war or to defend the country, etc. But they are assembled, and we use that for the military, all right? Like you saw it here when Napoleon with his ally, the king of Sardinia, mobilized troops against Austria. But don't get stuck with only this meaning of mobilize. Of course, you can mobilize support or people to do something. And when you do that, you succeed in encouraging people to take action, especially political action, I will have to say. But it is not always just to go to battle. Sometimes you go to a political battle, that's fine. But mobilize is not always used to talk about soldiers and war. But of course, in our context, it was exactly like that. And that was a new word you should add to your active vocabulary bank. But that's not the last. It's just the first word in today's episode. We still have 9. Our very next word is fester. F-E-S-T-E-R. Let's take a look at how we use that in context, and then I will ask you the question. The gentleman in white, that's what the soldiers called him, knelt in the dust in his linen suit, bathing their festering wounds and offering sips of water. So we're talking about festering wounds here. Well, My question is, which word could best replace festering in this context? Remember, we said festering wounds. So which word could best replace festering in this context? Interchangeable, scandalous, healing, or infected? Which do you think is the right answer? Think about it, and I'll be right back. Now, for those of you who thought infected was the best answer, you're absolutely right. If a wound festers, it becomes infected, and that means it becomes worse. And remember, we were talking about the time when we didn't have antibiotics or penicillin or stuff like that. So a festering wound would probably mean certain death. Even now, it's not a trivial matter. Of course, it is also dangerous nowadays, even with all the medications we have. But back then, it was a very painful experience that would lead to one inevitable end, which is death. But let's focus on fester itself. Remember, it means infected. When the wound gets infected, we can use fester. The wound festers or gets infected. That's our word, and that's not the last word. Our very next word is beset. B-E-S-E-T, beset. Let's take a look at how we use that in context. We said, on his return to Geneva, Switzerland, Dunant was beset with concern over the lack of organized medical care on the battlefield. So he was beset with concern. My question to you is, how can we best explain this word, beset? Can we say deprived of strength, troubled persistently, selected from a group, or ruined? Which one would you say is the best explanation of beset in this context? Think about it, and I'll be right back with the answer. For those of you who thought troubled persistently is the best explanation, you're absolutely right. If someone or something is beset by problems or fears, that means they have a lot of problems or fears which affect them severely. It's like they're plagued by these problems. They're always worried about these problems because they have a lot of problems. Now, for Dunant, it's not that he had a lot of problems. He didn't care about not getting the chance to meet Napoleon III and get this permit for his business, but he was beset by what he saw on the battlefield and the lack of organized medical care on the battlefield, which was a big deal. And I guess we're all thankful for one man who really cared. Now, maybe you would say eventually it would happen. Well, maybe, but it always starts with the idea of one man. Now, imagine how many people before Dunant saw the same thing and simply didn't care or didn't have an idea, didn't know what to do about it. But there was only one man who was so beset by what he saw, and he had this great idea that helped save millions of lives over the years. But that was our word, beset. Let's talk about the next word, alleviate. A-L-L-E-V-I-A-T-E. Alleviate. How do we use that in context? Well, we said obsessed with the idea, again, we're talking about Dunant, of course, obsessed with the idea of trying to alleviate future suffering and hoping to arouse in others his own fervent conviction that Europe's wounded soldiers should never again have to endure such dire suffering, he wrote a booklet titled A Memory of Solferino. So obsessed with the idea of trying to alleviate future suffering. Now, focus on alleviate here. My question is, which words could best replace alleviate in this context? Could we say determine beforehand, entrust to another, move cautiously forward, or make more bearable? Which do you think is the best answer? Think about it, and I'll be right back with the answer and a little bit of extra explanation. Now, for those of you who thought make more bearable is the best answer, you're absolutely right. If you alleviate pain, suffering, or an unpleasant condition, you make it less intense or severe. Well, it's not about erasing the problem or the suffering altogether, because in most cases you simply can't. But you're easing the suffering, you're reducing, you're relieving the suffering of other people. And that is probably what the International Red Cross does most of the time. Of course, they can save people's lives, but if there's a problem, if there's a war, they can't do anything about it. Because remember, the Red Cross is a neutral organization. They don't take sides. They only take the side of the injured. Whoever this person is, Whatever they did, they just treat the injured. They alleviate their pain, their suffering. They make it less intense or severe. And of course, they save lives in the process. So that was our word alleviate, but it is not the last word. Within the same sentence I just told you about, we had two more words, fervent and dire. Now let's talk about fervent first, and let me remind you with the context. We said obsessed with the idea of trying to alleviate future suffering, hoping to arouse in others his own fervent conviction that Europe's wounded soldiers should never again have to endure such dire suffering, he wrote the booklet titled A Memory of Solferino. Now, of course, our focus here on fervent. Next, we're going to talk about dire. But first, fervent. F-E-R-V-E-N-T. Now, my question is, which word or words could best replace fervent in this context? Now, remember, he hoped to arouse in others his own fervent conviction. Fervent conviction, that's the context. So, which word or words could best replace fervent in this context? Could we use sophisticated, having a bad disposition, passionate, or criminal? Which one do you think is the right answer? Think about it, and I'll be right back with the answer. Now, for those of you who thought passionate is the best word to replace fervent, you're absolutely right. A fervent person has or shows strong feelings about something and is very sincere and enthusiastic about it. So when we use fervent, we're not talking about a person who fakes this whole thing. No, these people are sincere and they're absolutely enthusiastic about whatever the cause is. Now, of course, for Dunant, it was the Red Cross eventually. But it was the sight of these soldiers enduring such dire suffering that he was so passionate about doing something about it, not just standing aside and doing nothing. That is the meaning of fervent, and within the same context, we had one more word, and that is dire. Now, let me remind you again, he did what he did. He was obsessed with the idea. He wanted everybody to have his own fervent conviction that Europe's wounded soldiers should never again have to endure such dire suffering. And that's when he wrote his booklet, A Memory of Solferino. Now, what is the meaning of dire, which is spelled, by the way, D-I-R-E, dire? We'll get to that, but let me ask you first. Which word or words could best replace dire in this context? Would you use dreadful, intermediate, rough or grating, or diverse? Which one do you think is the right answer? Think about it, and I'll be right back. Now, for those of you who thought dreadful is the right answer, you're absolutely right. We use dire to emphasize how serious or terrible a situation or event is. And here we're talking about the suffering. We're not just talking about any suffering. We're talking about dire suffering, terrible, awful, appalling, dreadful suffering. That is the meaning of dire. And now I don't want you to go anywhere because we still have 4 more words to go. You will want to learn about those words: zealous, heartening, actuate, and humanitarian. So don't go anywhere. We're going to talk about zealous now. Z-E-A-L-O-U-S, zealous. Let me remind you how we used it in context. That came from the question he posed at the end of his booklet, which was titled A Memory of Solferino. He asked, would it not be possible, in time of peace and quiet, to form relief societies for the purpose of having care given to the wounded in wartime by zealous, devoted, and thoroughly qualified volunteers? That was his question, and remember, that may be one of the most important questions in history because of the great response it got, and in a way or another, that was a question that contributed to the forming of the International Red Cross. But anyway, let's focus on our word, zealous. When you say someone is zealous, how can you best describe this person? Would you describe this person as physically or emotionally overcome? Would you describe this person as flourishing, extremely modest or shy, or enthusiastically devoted to a cause? Which do you think is the right answer? Think about it, and I'll be right back. Now, for those of you who thought that someone who is zealous can best be described as enthusiastically devoted to a cause, you're absolutely right. That's the meaning of zealous. Someone who is zealous spends a lot of time or energy in supporting something that they believe in very strongly, especially a political or religious ideal. Now, sometimes it's not a very good thing, let me tell you. Sometimes when you talk about zealous people, they take it to extremes that are too much. But anyway, the meaning of the word itself is not bad. Now, for example, our context here, it's totally fine. When we talked about zealous, devoted, and thoroughly qualified volunteers, we're talking about the Red Cross. We're talking about those people that devote a lot of time and energy to help other people, which is a great thing. But remember that you can use this word to describe someone who takes it a little bit too far, or maybe too far, especially when we talk about it in a political or religious context. But that was our word, zealous, and we still have 3 more words. The next word is heartening. Heartening, heartening. Let me remind you how we used that in context. We said, although the booklet aroused heartening interest throughout Europe when it was published in 1862, it moved a group of people in Geneva to take action. So it was not just like this heartening interest. No, it moved some people to take action. So my question is, which word or words could best replace heartening in this context? Would you use emotionless, gloomy, encouraging, or excessively sweet? What do you think the answer is? Think about it, and I'll be right back. Now, for those of you who thought encouraging would be the best word to replace heartening, in this context, you're absolutely right. When you describe something as heartening, you mean that it makes people happier and makes them more hopeful. It's like saying reassuring, cheering, promising, or making people hopeful, or just like we said, encouraging. So that was our word, heartening. The next word is actuate. A-C-T-U-A-T-E, actuate. Now, how do we use that in context? Let me remind you. We said philanthropists decided to form a committee to actuate Dunant's ideas and asked him to be a member. So, here we're talking about actuating Dunant's ideas. My question is, which word or words could best replace actuate in this context? Could we replace it with provide protection for, put into action, remain temporarily uninvolved in, or criticize? Which do you think is the right answer? Think about it, and I'll be right back. Now, for those of you who thought put into action would be the best choice to replace actuate in this context, you're absolutely right. When you actuate something, you put it into action. And here, remember, we said those philanthropists decided to form a committee to actuate Dunant's ideas. They didn't want those ideas to stay as ideas. They wanted to put them into action, to actuate. That was our word, and it's not the last word. The next one is. Humanitarian is our last word for today. Let me tell you how it is spelled first. It's Humanitarian. Humanitarian. Let's see how we use that in context. We said the Geneva Committee was discouraged, and that was after they were rejected by the soldiers who could not trust them. So the Geneva Committee was discouraged. If the relief societies were going to achieve their purpose, an international agreement of a purely humanitarian nature had to be reached. So our word, humanitarian. And my question, something that is humanitarian can be best explained as what? Devoted to the promotion of human welfare, as dazzling in appearance, as having a prolonged effect, or as confined to an exclusive group? Which do you think is the right answer? Think about it, and I'll be right back. Now, for those of you who chose devoted to the promotion of human welfare, you're absolutely right. That is what humanitarian is all about. If a person or society has humanitarian ideas or behavior, they try to avoid making people suffer, or they help people who are suffering. We're talking about charitable people, altruistic, humane, philanthropic. We have 10 words that we focus on, 10 key words. Make sure you add these 10 words to your active vocabulary bank. Let me remind you again, we talked about mobilize, fester, beset, alleviate, fervent, dire, zealous, heartening, actuate, and finally, humanitarian. I hope you learned a lot in today's episode, and remember, I will say that again because that's coming next week, and it is the perfect time to become a patron because you're going to have a lot of benefits coming your way. New episodes, new premium episodes are coming next week. As I told you, we're going to have vocabulary and speaking. We're going to have a very special nonfiction series and our premium fiction series. And last but not least, our premium business English series. So there's a lot you can get when you become a patron. Don't think twice about it. You will be supporting me and supporting the show, of course. I'm not denying that. This is one big purpose of even having this patron system in the first place, but you will get a lot of benefits in return. So don't think twice about it. The link is in the description of the episode. Take the link and go to my Patreon page, become a patron, and enjoy a lot of benefits. And not only the audio episodes, when you go there, you will see that there's a lot more. But anyway, that was everything I wanted to share with you in today's episode. I would like to thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this episode. I hope you learned a lot and you had a lot of fun. I will see you in other episodes. And remember, this week we have the last episodes of 2 series we've been running for a while now. We have the last episode of Shocking Event That Made History, and we have the last episode of our series, An Essential Guide to Your Body and Brain. So don't miss those. They're coming this week. And of course, remember to tune in on Friday because we're going to have our brand new episode, Plus Talk, which is going to be a very special episode I really think you're going to enjoy. So that was everything for today. Thank you very much for listening. This is your host, Danny. I will see you next time.